Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Henry. Today I'm going to go over with you all some historical context for John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, which is the next book that we're going to be reading. Historical context is an important part of life in literature. Without it, memories, stories, and characters, they just simply have less meaning to us. Basically, it's all the details of the time and place in which a situation occurs. And those details are what enable us to interpret and analyze works or events of the past, or even the future, rather than merely judging them by contemporary standards. So if you read something in the year 2020, and it was something that was written in 1920, we're going to read that piece. If we don't know about what was going on in the time period, we're going to read that through the eyes of someone in 2020. So we may not get the intended meaning. We may not understand certain references. We don't really know what the characters were going through because we don't understand what was going on in the time period. So this helps us to analyze the work more clearly and more deeply if we understand the context. In literature, a strong understanding of the historical context behind a work's creation can give us a better understanding of and appreciation for the narrative, for the story behind it. In analyzing historical events, context can help us understand what motivates people to behave as they did. In other words, things just make more sense to us if we understand them in the original context. Put another way, context is what gives meaning to the details. All right, so let's first talk about John Steinbeck, the author. He was born in Salinas, California, which also is the setting of the novella that we're going to read. This picture here on the bottom left is a modern-day picture of the Salinas River Valley, which you'll notice when we begin reading is a backdrop as part of the setting for the book. His family were not farmers, but even as a young man, Steinbeck was interested in the lives of farm laborers around him. He was just fascinated with learning more about their lives, their culture, what worried them, what concerned them, what their lives were like. So much so, in fact, that he even worked alongside migrant workers on a nearby sugar beet farm. He later even dropped out of Stanford University, which is a prestigious university, and decided to work as a manual laborer before becoming a writer. And it's during that experience that he pulls from to write the content of some of his work. Okay, so let's watch this brief video that gives a little bit more information about John Steinbeck.
Steinbeck is a celebrated author around the world.
Winner of the Nobel Prize in 1962, John Steinbeck gave voice to working-class America.
He writes about people we're not familiar with, but he makes them relatable to a general audience. In spite of the fact that he's writing about hobos and tramps and Okies and other people such as that, he manages to stress the universal condition that we all share.
John Ernst Steinbeck was born on February 27, 1902, in Salinas, California, a region that would later be the setting for many of his most famous works.
Steinbeck reflected California through the people and the landscape and the history. Not only was he a wonderful writer, but he was a great student of his own home.
Steinbeck enrolled in Stanford University in 1919, but eventually dropped out. He continued to write, but for years was simply scraping by, until 1935, when he would receive his first critical success.
Tortilla Flat was a huge bestseller. No one expected it. It sold 26,000 copies in its first year, which was astonishing during the middle of the Depression. It came out in 1935. This is a beautiful story about a gang of winos living in a rundown house in California just after World War I.
In 1937, Steinbeck's novella Of Mice and Men became an immediate bestseller, and its play adaptation won him the New York Drama Critics Circle Award.
What he wanted to do was to write something called a play novelette. He was playing with a new form of writing. He wanted the story to be lifted from the book onto the stage. He wanted it played. He wanted it performed.
I think what appealed to readers about Of Mice and Men was the fact that it dealt realistically with the grim situation of the Depression and the inability of people to find work. But it also struck an emotional chord with readers because in spite of all that, there's this very strong friendship between George and Lenny, and that seems to compensate for what they don't have in their lives.
Steinbeck reported on migrant farm workers for the San Francisco Chronicle in 1939, providing the basis for his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Grapes of Wrath.
The Grapes of Wrath was an immediate bestseller when it came out and remained on the bestseller list for more than a year.
It set a lot of things in motion. Not only is this a story about the Joads, but the story about a lot of people. It put a face on the harsh truths that were occurring at the time in this country.
In 1940, the screen version of The Grapes of Wrath became one of the first 25 films selected for preservation by the Library of Congress.
It's rare for a masterpiece to translate into a great film. The Grapes of Wrath, directed by John Ford, is a masterpiece in cinema history. The timing is perfect, the setting, the lighting, the characters.
Steinbeck died following a heart attack on December 20th, 1968, but left a legacy of 27 books.
Steinbeck had a huge, productive decade. Over a 10-year period, he produced half a dozen of America's great masterpieces in fiction.
So one of the things that's really interesting about John Steinbeck is that he experienced success while he was still alive, and his works were made into movies relatively shortly after they experienced wide success during the time it was read. So if you think about it, 1940, the 1930s, this is not a time when everyone had access to news or a television or a cell phone to get information about what was going on in the rest of the United States. So authors, they fulfilled a very important role in kind of painting a picture of what it was like for people as they endured certain things. So by writing The Grapes of Wrath and writing of Mice and Men and Tortilla Flat, he was really kind of giving insight to the rest of the world, even what was going on with the characters and by extension, the people. Even though his characters that he creates are fiction, works of fiction, they're not real. They represented real stories. So that's an important note about that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that contributed to the economic crisis in the 1930s, which was the time of the Great Depression. Now, the farming boom happened during World War I. So during World War I, American farmers were relied on heavily to supply crops for the European and Russian forces. So the price of crops soared, and U.S. farmers took out loans to buy more equipment and land to cover the demand and build up their farms. They thought it was a super safe bet, that their crops were needed. In fact, if you look at these posters that I found as kind of like a part of my research, these are very patriotic posters that really kind of call on farmers to do their patriotic duty to supply for the troops. So it was almost like something that they needed to do as Americans. So they invested. They bought expensive farm equipment. They bought more land, and they thought this is a safe bet because they're needed and it's not going to go anywhere. They weren't experiencing any drought. There hadn't been a drought in the U.S. since the 1890s. And so they felt like it was, even though it was during a time of war, they felt like it was safe for them to experience kind of this farming boom. Okay. Let's go ahead. All right. So this part right here is some discussion on something called buffalo grass. So let me first explain what this even is. So I found this website here. Buffalo grass basically gets its name from bison or buffalo because it's the grass that they prefer to eat, hence the name. It's a low maintenance grass. It is roughly pretty much drought tolerant, and it's the type of grass that covers the Great Plains. And so farmers, while they bought all of this expensive farming equipment, took out loans and bought more land, and they have this awesome buffalo grass that's indestructible, they went ahead and created this type of farm that did not do what farms typically did. So typically, farms, let's say you have, just for the sake of example, you have 100 acres. Normally, farms do not farm all 100 acres every single year. They will give maybe a fourth of the acreage a break. So 25 acres will just not be plowed, not be harvested, and they'll take a break. And it'll rotate to a different acreage so that the soil remains rich and nutrient dense and fresh for planting for the next season. So let's watch this video on what they consider to be indestructible buffalo grass.
Modern machinery made wheat farming more efficient and still profitable, even at prices of $1 per bushel. Powerful gasoline tractors, pulling broad arrays of disc plows, turned the sod with ease.
In the 1920s, there was a concerted movement at the highest levels of American society to turn agriculture into an industrial model, to make every farm into a factory. Well, you could never have plowed up 30-some million acres of land with horse and a wooden plow, or even a steel plow. Tractors were going all night long with headlights burning to plow up this land to get it into production.
In southeastern Colorado, Calvin Craybill's father hoped to make a life for himself and his family, raising horses and cattle. But to get ahead, he took a job driving a tractor on other people's land.
He worked nights. Somebody else worked days, and so he worked nights. He knew that buffalo grass was the natural turf of that country, and it was grazing country. He didn't stay with the tractoring thing too long because I think it just got his heart. He couldn't stand it, and I think even though he needed the money, he quit doing it. He just couldn't stand to do it. He was really a stockman, and he knew it was all wrong, and he paid the price for it later.
In previous years, farmers had used a plow called a lister that split the soil in two directions and dug a deep furrow that caught and held blowing soil. Now, the most commonly used plow was called a one-way, which was cheaper and tore through the sod at a faster rate.
In the late 20s, the crops were good, the prices were good, and so everybody, the thing to do was to break out everything and get it in wheat. And practically everybody did that.
This boom was one of the great classic American bubbles. We've had a lot of them in our history, and this was one. They had these suitcase farmers who would get off the train, and they called them suitcase farmers because they're dandies from the city. They weren't farmers, and they had their suitcases, and they'd go out and they'd claim their square mile because they enlarged the Homestead Act. Then they'd get someone to plow up the grass, throw some of this turkey red wheat into the ground, and then go back to town and come back in the spring and harvest this thing. And it was a fool's game. You could make a lot of money.
The suitcase farmers have hired the preparation of large areas of land all around us, which no longer represent the idea of homes at all, but just parts of a potential factory for the low-cost production of wheat.
During the last 5 years of the 1920s alone, another 5,260,000 acres of native sod, an area the size of New Hampshire, was turned over on the southern plains. The soil, a federal agency confidently proclaimed, is the one indestructible, immutable asset that the nation possesses. It is the one resource that cannot be exhausted, that cannot be used up.
The Great Plow-Up had going for it ample rainfall for a period of 10 or 15 years, and it just kept encouraging more and more. People thought, as they think again and again, that we've turned the corner on climate here. We can see far into the future and it's all wet. They knew that there'd been severe droughts in the 1890s, but people forgot about those. They thought that was the past. This is now, and this will be the future.
A handful of old-timers, especially the cattlemen who had been through those droughts, weren't so sure. To them, the southern plains were a grassland, and the sod should never be turned.
Bam White, who was a half Apache, half Anglo cowboy living in the Texas Panhandle, said to his son, who asked him what was the problem, he said, "Look at it, wrong side up. It's wrong side up."
Okay, so that gives us our content for this phase of understanding the context. And hope you understood it, and we'll pick up with this again the next segment.